The Grand Hall of the Galactic Concord Assembly was a place built to humble even the most powerful beings in the known universe, and it did its job well every single day. Thousands of delegates from over 4,000 spacefaring civilizations sat in rising tiers of crystal and living stone, their voices blending into a constant hum that sounded like the breathing of some vast creature. And in the center of it all floated a platform of pure light, where the elder races spoke their commands and shaped the future of 100 billion worlds. The Krython hegemony held the highest seats, their insectoid ambassadors towering over most other species, with armored bodies that clicked and scraped against the polished floors whenever they moved, and they spoke with the casual authority of a civilization that had dominated galactic politics for over 6,000 years. Beside them sat the crystalline figures of the Vorel Dominion, beings made of living mineral that refracted light into tiny rainbows with every gesture. And above them all hovered the Etheri Communion, ancient energy beings who rarely spoke, but whose silence carried more weight than any speech. And then there were the humans. Director Alara Vasquez sat in her assigned seat, in the middle tiers, surrounded by delegations from dozens of other species that the galaxy considered middle tier, civilizations that were spacefaring and competent, but held no real power in the grand scheme of things. She was a small woman by most species standards, with dark hair pulled back from a face that revealed nothing, and she watched the proceedings with the patience of someone who had learned long ago that the best strategy in this hall was to be forgotten. Humanity had joined the Galactic Concord just over 300 years ago, and in that time they had done almost nothing remarkable, or at least that was what everyone believed. They voted conservatively, they avoided conflicts, they maintained a modest fleet of aging warships, and they kept to their little corner of the galaxy like quiet tenants who always paid their rent on time and never complained about the noise. Today, the Krython High Ambassador was proposing a new expansion of hegemony patrol zones into neutral buffer space. And Vasquez listened as species after species either supported the motion out of fear or opposed it with words that carried no real weight. And when it came time for humanity's vote, she raised her hand in abstention, drawing not a single glance from anyone in the chamber. That was exactly how she wanted it. 3,000 light-years away from the gleaming towers of Valtheris Prime, in a region of space that most galactic charts labeled as Human Ecological Preserve, Restricted Access, something was happening that would have made every delegate in that grand hall lose their minds. The Oort Cloud exclusion zones were vast stretches of cold and empty space that humanity had claimed decades ago for what they called dark matter research and long-term environmental studies. And the rest of the galaxy had accepted this without question, because no one cared about a few patches of frozen nothing at the edge of human territory. But the zones were not empty, and they had never been used for research. Deep inside the largest exclusion zone, hidden behind layers of sensor spoofing technology so advanced that it had taken humanity's best engineers 40 years just to design it, there existed the greatest secret in the history of the galaxy. Admiral Konstantin Morozov stood on an observation platform that jutted out from a construction scaffold the size of a small moon, and he looked out at something that made his heart beat faster, no matter how many times he saw it. It was a ship. No, that word was too small, too ordinary for what floated before him in the darkness between stars. It was a world made of metal, a sphere of dark alloy and impossible engineering that stretched 11,400 kilometers from one side to the other, its hull curving away in every direction until it vanished into the black of space. And even from this distance, he could see the faint glow of internal systems running through its skin like veins of fire beneath the surface of a sleeping giant. This was HWS-01, and its name was Prometheus. Beside him stood Dr. Yuki Tanaka, the chief engineer of Project Leviathan, and the woman who had spent the last 30 years of her life turning an insane dream into physical reality. And she was running her fingers across a data tablet with the calm focus of someone who had long ago made peace with the scale of what they were building. Hull integrity on sections 7 through 19 is holding at full specification, she said without looking up. And the stellar core energy siphon completed its third successful test cycle this morning. We pulled enough power in 4 seconds to run the entire Earth grid for a year. Morozov nodded, but said nothing for a long moment, his eyes still fixed on the curve of Prometheus, as a fleet of construction drones moved across its surface like tiny insects crawling over a planet. Between a handful of military leaders and politicians who had looked at the galaxy and seen what nobody else wanted to admit, that the galactic concord was not a union of equals, but a hierarchy of predators, and that every species that lacked the strength to defend itself would eventually be swallowed by one that did. The Crithian had already annexed dozens of weaker civilizations. The Vorel Dominion controlled trade routes with an iron grip, and the elder races set rules that always seemed to benefit those who were already powerful. Humanity had a choice. They could accept their place as a quiet, forgettable middle-tier species and hope that the predators never turned their eyes toward Earth. Or they could do something about it. They chose to do something about it. And so Project Leviathan was born. A plan so ambitious, so enormous, so wildly beyond anything any species had ever attempted, that the humans who first proposed it admitted openly that it sounded like madness, but madness, they argued, was sometimes the only sane response to an insane situation. For 140 years, humanity had carefully and deliberately faked its own decline, reducing visible industrial output while secretly funneling the true capacity of every colony, every station, every factory and shipyard into hidden construction zones. And every sensor grid in the galaxy confirmed what humanity wanted them to see, a stagnating species with an aging fleet and shrinking ambitions. Meanwhile, back on Valtherus Prime, a young Crython intelligence analyst named Sekval sat alone in his office, staring at a data screen that showed something no one else seemed to care about. Human industrial output had dropped by 22% over the past 60 years. And yet, their population was growing, their colonies were expanding, and their energy consumption, buried deep in secondary data that most analysts never bothered to read, was actually increasing. Where was all that energy going? Where was all that material going? Sekval had filed a report, flagging the discrepancy, and his superiors had sent it back with a note that said, "Low priority. Species show signs of standard economic plateau." And he had filed it again, with additional data, and they had buried it again. And now he sat alone, with a feeling in his gut that something was very wrong, and no one was listening. He was right, and by the time anyone listened, it would be far too late. On the observation platform, Morozov's communicator chimed with a priority signal, a coded transmission from Earth's United Governing Council, encrypted with protocols that only 7 people in all of human space could unlock. He read the message once, then read it again, and his jaw tightened. "The Crython are mobilizing border fleets near Rathani space," he said quietly to Tanaka. "The Council is moving up our timeline." Tanaka looked up from her tablet for the first time, and something flickered in her eyes. Not fear, not excitement, but the steady resolve of a woman who had built giants and was now about to watch them wake. "How soon?" she asked. Morozov looked back out at Prometheus, at the world ship that he had given his life to build, and he felt the weight of everything that was about to change settle onto his shoulders like gravity itself. "Now," he said, "awaken the Leviathans." The Crython hegemony had ruled through fear for 6,000 years. And fear, like any tool used too often, had become so natural to them that they no longer recognized it as a choice. It was simply the way the galaxy worked. When the hegemony wanted something, they took it, and when a species stood in their way, they crushed it. And when the Galactic Concord raised concerns, the Chthon reminded everyone that their fleet was the largest in the galaxy, and that stability depended on no one forgetting that fact. So when the Chthon High Command turned its attention to the Rithani Collective, a peaceful agrarian civilization of gentle four-armed beings who had never fired a weapon in anger in their entire history, nobody was surprised, and nobody moved to stop them. The ultimatum arrived on the Rithani homeworld, like a death sentence delivered in polite language. Submit to hegemony vassalage within 30 standard days, or face orbital bombardment. Of vassalage included the surrender of all territorial sovereignty, the integration of Rithani agricultural output into hegemony supply chains, and the voluntary relocation of Rithani populations to labor colonies on Chthon border worlds. Ambassador Aurum Shell, the Rithani representative to the Galactic Concord, stood before the Grand Assembly and begged for help, with tears running down his weathered face, and the chamber listened in silence. And when he finished speaking, the Chthon High Ambassador simply reminded the Assembly that hegemony expansion into unclaimed buffer zones was within the legal framework of existing treaties. No one voted to intervene, and Aurum Shell walked out of the chamber, feeling as though the floor had opened beneath him and swallowed everything he had ever believed about justice. He was sitting alone in the Rithani diplomatic quarters, staring at the wall and trying to find the words to tell his people that the galaxy had abandoned them. When there was a quiet knock at his door, Director Elara Vasquez entered without ceremony, her expression calm and unreadable, and she sat down across from him as though they were about to discuss something as ordinary as a trade agreement. "Do not surrender," she said. Aurum Shell looked at her with the hollow eyes of a man who had spent the last 3 days contemplating the extinction of his culture, and could not understand why the human ambassador was telling him something so foolish. "We have no fleet," he said. "We have no weapons, no allies, no hope. What would you have us do, Ambassador?" "Delay them," Vasquez replied, and there was something in her voice that made Aurum Shell pay attention despite everything. A weight, a certainty, a controlled fire that he had never heard from any human before. "Ask for extensions, demand negotiations, argue over the terms, buy time, Ambassador, and trust me when I tell you that you have friends you do not know about." Yet she left before he could ask what she meant, and he sat alone in the silence, trying to decide if the human ambassador was offering him hope or cruelty. 3,000 light-years away, inside the body of a world that should not have existed, Dr. Yuki Tanaka walked through a corridor wide enough to fly a shuttle through, and tried not to think about the fact that she was technically standing inside a weapon of unimaginable destruction that also happened to contain forests. The interior of HWS-01 Prometheus was not what anyone would have expected from a warship, because it was not just a warship. It was a civilization compressed into a sphere of metal and light and living things. She passed through a residential sector where families lived in homes built along the inner curve of the hull, with artificial sunlight streaming through atmospheric processors that maintained a sky so convincing that children who had been born here sometimes forgot they were inside a world. Ship at all. And beyond the residential sectors lay agricultural zones where crops grew in soil manufactured from asteroid material. And beyond those lay industrial complexes where factories hummed day and night, producing everything from replacement hull plating to medical supplies. Tanaka had walked these corridors 1,000 times, but today felt different, because today she knew that the quiet years were ending, and the Leviathans would soon step out of the shadows and into a galaxy that was not ready for them. She reached the command center, a vast chamber buried deep in the core of Prometheus, where holographic displays painted the air with tactical data, and found Admiral Morozov addressing his senior staff with the controlled intensity of a man who had spent his entire career preparing for a moment he had hoped would never come. "What I am about to tell you is the full scope of Project Leviathan," Morozov said, and the officers around the table leaned forward, because even they, the commanders of the most powerful weapon ever built, did not know everything. For 140 years, humanity has conducted the largest and most deliberate act of strategic deception in galactic history. He activated a display that showed a timeline stretching back to the earliest days of humanity's membership in the Concord. And as he spoke, the data unfolded like a map of an invisible war fought entirely in secret. Every colony that appeared to stagnate was actually redirecting its output through hidden supply chains, he explained. Every ship that was publicly decommissioned was quietly stripped for raw materials and fed into construction zones that do not appear on any galactic chart. Every research station, every mining outpost, every orbital platform that looked like it was falling apart was actually a node in the largest manufacturing network ever assembled by any species. The numbers were staggering. Trillions of tons of refined metals, energy output equivalent to harvesting entire stars, labor forces numbering in the hundreds of millions, all hidden behind a mask of decline that the galaxy had accepted without question, because nobody expected anything remarkable from humans. "We did not stagnate," Morozov said, and his voice carried the quiet pride of a man who had watched his species perform the impossible. "We consolidated every resource, every mind, every ounce of will that our civilization could produce. We poured into 7 ships that will change the meaning of power in this galaxy forever." He brought up images of the Leviathans, all 7 of them, hanging in the darkness like worlds that had been forged rather than born, and he named them one by one. Prometheus, fully operational, crew complement of 32 million, weapon systems including a stellar core energy siphon capable of channeling the power output of a small star into a single directed beam. Fully operational, optimized for fleet coordination and electronic warfare, carrying an internal fleet of 4,000 conventional warships. Ragnarok, fully operational, the heaviest armed of the 7, designed as a siege platform capable of engaging entire planetary defense networks alone. Susanoo, combat-ready within weeks, specialized in rapid deployment and system denial operations. Durga, combat-ready within weeks, the most heavily armored, designed to absorb punishment that would shatter moons and keep fighting. Coyote, completing final construction, built for speed and tactical deception, with stealth systems that can hide a world-sized object in open space. Enkidu, completing final construction, equipped with the most advanced sensor and communication arrays ever designed, capable of monitoring an entire galactic sector in real time. The room was silent when he finished, and Morozov let the silence hold, because he understood that what he was asking these officers to do was not simply fight a battle. It was to step into history and accept that nothing would ever be the same. Meanwhile, in a detention cell on the Krython intelligence station orbiting their homeworld, Sekval sat in darkness and cursed his own people for their blindness. He had tried to warn them. He had found the anomalies, traced the gravitational fluctuations near human space, even hacked into a decommissioned relay probe and captured a single fragmented image before his feed was severed. And what he had seen in that image had made his blood run cold. A sliver of something vast, impossibly vast, reflecting starlight against the void. Something that was clearly artificial, and clearly the size of a small world, hidden in a region of space that every sensor grid in the galaxy said was empty. He had tried to send his findings to Krython High Command, and they had arrested him for unauthorized intelligence activity. Because admitting that the humans might have been hiding something enormous would mean admitting that the hegemony's intelligence apparatus had failed for over a century. And that was an admission no one in power was willing to make. So Sekval sat in his cell, and somewhere in the darkness between stars, the Leviathans were waking up, and the galaxy was about to learn a lesson that it would never forget. On the bridge of Prometheus, Morozov received the final confirmation. Krython border fleets had jumped toward Rathani space, and the invasion was underway. He looked at Tanaka, and she looked back at him, and in that shared glance was everything. The fear, the determination, the weight of 140 years of sacrifice and secrecy, and the knowledge that in the next few hours, either everything they had built would save the galaxy, or it would all have been for nothing. "Light the engines," Morozov ordered, and his voice carried across the command center. Like a bell ringing in the dark. "All 7, it is time the galaxy met us properly." And deep within Prometheus, deep within all 7 Leviathans, engines the size of cities roared to life for the first time, and the darkness trembled. War Admiral Drekath of the Krython hegemony had conquered 11 species in his career, and he had done it the same way every time. Arrive with overwhelming force, broadcast the surrender demand, watch the fear take hold, and then collect whatever was left after the resistance crumbled. The Rathani would be no different. His 3rd Expeditionary Armada dropped out of faster-than-light travel in perfect formation. 1,600 warships spread across Rathani border space like a wall of sharpened metal, each one bristling with weapons that could crack a continent. And at the center of it all sat his flagship, the Krython dreadnought Ironmaw, a ship so massive that smaller vessels had to adjust their courses just to avoid its gravitational pull. "Begin the broadcast," Drekath ordered, settling into his command throne with the easy confidence of a predator who had never once been prey. The surrender demand went out on all frequencies. Ultimatum, giving the Rathani 12 hours to disarm their orbital stations and open their atmosphere to Krython landing forces. And Drekath watched the Rathani communication channels light up with panic and confusion and despair, and he felt the familiar satisfaction of a job already half finished. Then every sensor on every ship in his armada screamed at once. The tactical officer at the forward station made a sound that Drekath had never heard a Krython warrior make. Something between a gasp and a whimper. And the War Admiral turned toward the main display screen, expecting to see perhaps a Rathani defense platform, or a desperate last stand by some pathetic collection of civilian transports. What he saw instead made him grip the arms of his command throne so hard that the metal bent under his claws. 7 contacts had appeared at the edge of the system, and they were not ships. They were too large to be ships, too large to be stations, too large to be anything that should exist in the vacuum of space, and the tactical computer was struggling to classify them because their mass readings were closer to moons than to any vessel in any database. What am I looking at?" Drekath whispered, and the bridge crew around him had gone absolutely silent. Every eye fixed on the display, where 7 impossible objects moved in perfect coordinated formation toward the center of the system. The communication officer's voice shook when she spoke. "War Admiral, we are receiving a transmission on all frequencies, all languages, every known galactic standard. It is coming from the contacts." "Put it through," Drekath commanded, and his voice was steady only because 6,000 years of Krython warrior breeding would not let it be anything else. The voice that filled the bridge of the Ironmaw was calm and human, and carried the weight of something that had been waiting a very long time to speak. "Konstantin Morozov of the human Leviathan fleet, broadcasting to all vessels in this system. You are targeting a species under our protection, and we are here to inform you that this will not be permitted. Withdraw your forces immediately and return to hegemony space, or we will demonstrate why that would be the wise choice." Drekath stared at the display as the 7 contacts grew closer, and the tactical computer finally finished its calculations and displayed numbers that made his tactical officers look at each other with naked fear in their eyes. Each contact was approximately 11,000 kilometers in diameter. roughly the size of the human homeworld's moon, and each one was radiating energy signatures that individually exceeded the combined output of his entire 1,600-ship armada. "Humans," Drekak said, and the word came out flat and disbelieving, because in his entire career he had never considered the humans worth thinking about. And now, 7 of their ships, if they could even be called ships, were drifting toward him like planets that had learned to hunt. His second-in-command leaned close and spoke in a voice meant only for the War Admiral's ears. "Sir, the energy readings alone suggest weapons capability far beyond anything in our threat assessments. I strongly recommend we withdraw and regroup while we analyze." "We do not withdraw," Drekak snapped, because Hegemony High Command was watching through the real-time tactical feed, and retreating without firing a shot would end his career and possibly his life. "They are bluffing. No species builds weapons that large. It is a projection, a holographic deception." But the gravity sensors did not lie, and gravity sensors could not be fooled by holograms, and every reading confirmed that 7 objects with the mass of small moons were physically present in this system, and getting closer by the minute. "Respond to the human transmission," ordered. "Tell them the hegemony does not recognize unauthorized military assets in sovereign operational space, and that any interference will be treated as an act of war." The response from Morozov came back within seconds, and his tone had not changed at all. "War Admiral, we hoped you would choose wisdom, but we understand that sometimes a demonstration is necessary. Please direct your sensors toward the gas giant in the outer system, and observe." Drekak felt something cold move through his body. Not fear, he told himself. Never fear, as the tactical display shifted to show the system's outer gas giant, a massive ball of hydrogen and helium that had been spinning quietly in the darkness for billions of years. One of the 7 Leviathans, the one broadcasting the identifier HWS-03 Ragnarok, rotated slowly, and a section of its hull opened like an eye. And from within that opening came a light so bright that sensors across the entire system had to automatically dim themselves to avoid overload. A beam of energy, pure, focused, impossible, lanced across the void and struck the gas giant. And for 4 seconds it held steady while every ship in Drekak's armada watched in stunned silence. When the beam cut off, the gas giant was dying. Its upper atmosphere had been stripped away like skin peeled from fruit, and its core, normally hidden beneath thousands of kilometers of compressed gas, was exposed and destabilizing. And within minutes, the entire planet began to collapse inward as gravitational forces tore it apart from the inside, and shockwaves rippled through the system so powerful that even ships millions of kilometers away rocked on their stabilizers. One shot from one weapon on one of 7 ships had killed a planet. The bridge of the Iron Maw was silent in a way that Drekak had never experienced. Not the disciplined silence of soldiers awaiting orders, but the absolute stillness of beings who had just watched the rules of the universe change in front of their eyes. "War Admiral," his second-in-command said, and this time he did not bother to whisper. "We need to leave. Now." Drekak looked at the display, at the 7 Leviathans still approaching, at the shattered remains of a gas giant that had existed for longer than the Krithan species, at the energy readings that told him each of those ships could do the same thing again and again and again, and for the first time in his life, he gave an order to retreat. "All ships, emergency withdrawal. Jump to FTL immediately. All vectors, do not wait for formation protocols." The 3rd Expeditionary Armada scattered like insects fleeing a fire, 1,600 warships breaking formation and diving into faster-than-light travel with a desperation that would have shamed any Krithan commander under normal circumstances. But these were not normal circumstances, and several captains did not even wait for Drekak's official order before running. Within minutes, The system was empty of Krython ships, and the Rethani orbital stations, which had been preparing for destruction, found themselves looking up at 7 world-sized guardians, floating serenely in their sky. On the surface of the Rethani homeworld, Ambassador Oram Shell stood outside his home and stared up at the night sky where new stars had appeared. 7 points of light that had not been there an hour ago. And he remembered Vasquez's words, and he wept, because she had been right about everything. Across the galaxy, the footage spread like wildfire. Long-range observation arrays from dozens of species had captured every moment: the arrival of the Leviathans, the transmission, the death of the gas giant, the panicked retreat of the Krython armada. And within hours, every government, every intelligence bureau, every military command, and every frightened citizen in the Galactic Concord had seen what humanity had been hiding. Emergency sessions were called on every major world. Communication channels overloaded and crashed and were rebuilt and overloaded again. And species that had never bothered to learn where Earth was on a star chart were suddenly sending frantic diplomatic inquiries to every human embassy they could find. On Valtheris Prime, in the Grand Concord Assembly, the chamber was packed with more delegates than had attended any session in living memory. And when Director Ilara Vasquez walked through the great doors and made her way to her usual seat in the middle tiers, the entire hall, all 4,000 civilizations, all the murmuring and arguing and posturing, fell absolutely dead silent. Every eye in the chamber was on her, and she felt the weight of their stares like sunlight after years in shadow. And she sat down, folded her hands in her lap, and smiled politely. She said nothing at all, because nothing needed to be said. The galaxy had finally met. Humanity and humanity had made quite an introduction. The Krythan's supreme overmind did not panic, because the overmind was not a single being, but a council of the 12 most powerful rulers in hegemony history. And they had survived crises before. Rebellions, border wars, plagues that had eaten entire colony worlds, and they had survived them all through one simple principle: when threatened, become the bigger threat. The footage from Rethani space played on a loop in their war chamber as they debated behind sealed doors, and every time the gas giant died on screen, the chamber grew a little quieter. But the conclusion they reached was not surrender. It was escalation. If we allow these weapons to exist unchallenged, the first voice of the Overmind declared, then within a decade, humanity will be beyond any force's ability to contain. They must be destroyed now, while we still have the numbers to overwhelm them. And so the Krythan hegemony mobilized everything, not just their primary battle fleets, but their reserve forces, their border garrisons, their vassal conscript fleets, pulled from a dozen subjugated species. And when the final count was tallied, the armada numbered 42,000 warships, the largest military force assembled in galactic history. On Valtheris Prime, the Concord Assembly devolved into chaos that made the usual political bickering look like polite dinner conversation. The Krythan ambassadors stood before the assembly and invoked ancient military articles, demanding a united galactic coalition against humanity, on the grounds that the Leviathans represented an existential threat to all civilized species. And his words were calculated to turn fear into a weapon more powerful than any battleship. Several species, those who feared humanity's new power or owed debts to the hegemony, voiced support, and for a moment, it seemed like the galaxy might actually unite against the very species that had just saved the Rethani from extinction. Vasquez rose from her seat, and the chamber fell silent in a way that had become very familiar whenever she moved. "Distinguished members of this assembly," she began, and her voice was steady and clear and carried to every corner of the vast hall. "The hegemony calls us a threat, and I understand why. We hid 7 warships the size of worlds, and that is frightening, and I will not pretend otherwise." She paused, And then she activated a holographic display that filled the center of the chamber with data, documents, recordings, sensor logs, testimony from survivors, evidence that humanity's intelligence services had been quietly gathering for over a century. But before you decide who the real threat is, I ask you to look at this. The evidence told a story that many species had suspected, but none had dared to speak aloud. A detailed history of Krython atrocities spanning thousands of years, including the forced annexation of weaker civilizations, orbital bombardments against civilian populations, genetic modification programs imposed on subjugated species without consent, and the quiet, deliberate extinction of at least 2 sentient species whose only crime had been occupying territory the hegemony wanted. We built the Leviathans because no one else would protect the powerless, Vasquez said, and her voice hardened with a conviction that made delegates from 100 worlds lean forward in their seats. We hid them because if we had not, the hegemony would have tried to destroy them before they were finished. And now we are asking this body one simple question. Will you stand with the protector or with the predator? The assembly fractured along lines that surprised almost everyone. The Vorel Dominion declared neutrality, as they always did when forced to choose sides. And the Aethery Communion, ancient and inscrutable, issued a single statement that scholars would debate for generations. The young fire burns. We will observe. But dozens of smaller species, the Rithani, the amphibious Drawl, the silicon-based Korvathi, and many others who had lived for centuries under the shadow of Krythan power, stood one by one and declared their alignment with humanity, and a counter-coalition formed that was small in military strength, but enormous in moral weight. And then Sekval struck his blow. The young Krythan analyst had been freed from his detention cell by a defection network, Krythan citizens who had grown sick of their government's cruelty, and he broadcast his original findings across every open channel in the galaxy. The buried intelligence report, the proof that Krythan leadership had known something was happening in human space, and had chosen to ignore it out of pure arrogance, and the internal communications showing that his superiors had actively suppressed his warnings, rather than admit their intelligence apparatus had failed. Confidence in the hegemony's image of infallibility, and across Krython space, cracks began to form. But the Armada was already moving, 42,000 ships advancing on human space, with the desperate fury of a predator that knows it must kill now, or be dethroned forever. And Admiral Morozov chose to meet them in the Helos Expanse, a vast region of open space, far from any inhabited world, chosen specifically so that the battle would not destroy innocent lives. The Battle of the Helos Expanse began at 0347 Galactic Standard Time, and it began with a sight that every species in the galaxy would remember for the rest of their existence. 7 Leviathans dropped out of faster-than-light travel, in a formation that spread across millions of kilometers of space, each one a dark sphere that blotted out the stars behind it. And as they took their positions, the bay doors along their hulls began to open. Massive hatches, each one large enough to swallow a conventional battleship, and from within poured the internal fleets. Thousands upon thousands of human warships launched from each Leviathan, emerging in disciplined waves that filled the void with the glow of their engines, and within minutes the space around the 7 world ships was alive with a swarm of vessels that outnumbered the Krythan expectations by a factor they had not prepared for. The Krythan strategy was simple and brutal. Divide the fleet into 7 attack groups of 6,000 ships each, overwhelm each Leviathan through concentrated fire, and trust that no single target, no matter how large, could withstand the combined assault of thousands of warships. They were wrong. The battle was a nightmare for the Krython from the first volley, because the Leviathans were not merely large. They were designed by a species that had spent 140 years imagining every possible attack scenario and engineering solutions for each one. Prometheus anchored the center of the formation, its stellar core cannon firing in controlled bursts that vaporized Krithan capital ships 3 at a time, while Athena coordinated the movements of every human vessel in the battle space with a tactical processing system so advanced that each ship received updated orders every half-second. Ragnarok lived up to its name, wading into the thickest concentration of enemy fire and responding with weapon systems that the galaxy had no names for. Gravity pulse generators that crushed ships like paper, plasma cascade arrays that turned entire attack wings into expanding clouds of superheated gas, and kinetic accelerators that launched projectiles at a fraction of the speed of light. But the Krithan were not cowards, and they did not break easily. 6,000 ships converged on HWS-05 Durga in a concentrated assault that represented the most firepower ever directed at a single target in recorded history, and, for terrible minutes, it seemed like even a world ship could be brought down through sheer overwhelming force. Durga's port hemisphere burned. Entire sectors of its surface erupted in explosions that could be seen from light minutes away, debris fields trailing behind it like blood from a wound. And damage reports flooded in as sections of the ship lost atmosphere and crew members died in the hundreds. But Durga held the line. Its armor, layered composites dozens of kilometers thick, designed to absorb the kind of punishment that would crack actual moons, bent and buckled, but did not break, and its weapons never stopped firing, and its internal fleet poured out of undamaged bay doors on the starboard side to harass the attackers from unexpected angles. And then HWS-06 Coyote did something that no tactical manual in any species military had ever described. It used its own mass, its sheer world-sized gravitational presence, to generate a localized gravity well that pulled an entire Krithan attack wing off course and sent 300 ships tumbling helplessly into the firing solution of HWS-02 Athena, which destroyed them in a single coordinated salvo. The Krithan armada broke. It did not happen all at once, but in a cascade. First the vassal conscript fleets, who had never wanted to fight this battle in the first place. Then the reserve formations. Then the border garrisons. And finally the primary battle fleets themselves, as ship after ship recognized that they were not fighting an enemy, but a force of nature. Over 14,000 Krithan ships were destroyed or disabled before the retreat became total, and the rest scattered into faster-than-light travel in every direction, leaving behind a battlefield of wreckage and silence. War Admiral Drekath's flagship, the Iron Maw, was crippled by a precision strike from Prometheus that disabled its engines without destroying the vessel, and when human marines boarded the drifting dreadnought, they found Drekath standing on his bridge, alone, staring at a tactical display that showed nothing but human contacts in every direction. He surrendered without a word. On the bridge of Prometheus, Admiral Morozov stood amid the quiet celebration of his officers, and felt no joy, only the heavy, necessary grief of a man who had just overseen the deaths of thousands on both sides of a battle that he wished had never been needed. "Begin search and rescue operations," he ordered. "All survivors, ours and theirs." His operations officer hesitated for just a moment. "Sir, the Krithan crews, some of them are still armed. Recovery could be—" "All survivors," Morozov repeated, and his voice left no room for argument. "We built these ships to end the age of predators, not to become one." And across the Helos expanse, human rescue ships fanned out into the wreckage and began pulling Krithan survivors from their shattered vessels. Survivors. It was the first act of mercy they had ever received from a species they had been taught to consider inferior. On Valtherus Prime, Ambassador Vasquez received a transmission that made her sit very still for a very long time. A message from the Aetheri Communion, the oldest civilization in the galaxy, who had not spoken directly to any species in living memory. The message contained a single line: "Come, We would like to speak with you. 3 months after the Battle of the Helos Expanse, the galaxy was still trying to understand what had happened to it. The old order, the comfortable hierarchy where the strong dominated and the weak accepted their place and everyone pretended this was stability, had been shattered so completely that even the species who had benefited from it could not put the pieces back together. And in the space where that old order had stood, something new and uncertain and terrifying and hopeful was beginning to grow. The Chthon hegemony was falling apart from the inside. Vassal species that had been held in subjugation for centuries saw the footage of the Helos Expanse and understood for the first time that the hegemony was not invincible, and revolts erupted across Chthon territory. Not violent rebellions, but quiet, determined refusals to cooperate, to produce, to obey. And the hegemony discovered that an empire built on fear collapses the moment fear is no longer. The supreme overmind, stripped of its armada and its reputation, and facing the disintegration of everything the hegemony had built over 6,000 years, did the only thing it could. It sued for peace. The terms were drafted by Ambassador Vasquez and the Allied coalition, and they were thorough and uncompromising. Complete military drawdown to defensive levels only. Reparations to every species the hegemony had annexed or harmed. The immediate release of all subjugated populations. The dissolution of forced labor colonies, and the establishment of an independent tribunal to investigate Chthon war crimes going back 1,000 years. It was the first time in galactic history that a dominant military power had been held accountable by a coalition that included species most of the galaxy had once considered too small and too weak to matter. And the fact that it was humanity, the quiet, forgettable middle-tier species that nobody had taken seriously. That coalition made the moment even more extraordinary. But the most remarkable event of those 3 months did not happen in a courtroom or a political chamber. It happened at the edge of known space, in a place older than most stars. The Aethery Threshold was a megastructure that defied every principle of engineering that any living species understood. A ring of crystallized energy orbiting a black hole, built so long ago that the Aethery themselves could not remember its construction, and no non-Aethery being had ever been invited inside. Until now. Ambassador Vasquez and Admiral Morozov traveled to the threshold aboard a diplomatic shuttle, accompanied by a small escort that felt absurdly tiny next to the structure that grew in their viewports as they approached. A ring so vast that entire solar systems could have fit inside its circumference, glowing with a light that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The Aethery who greeted them did not have a body in any conventional sense. It was a presence, a warmth, a voice that seemed to come from inside their own minds, and it spoke with the patience of something that had been alive for longer than most civilizations had existed. We have watched every species that has risen to power in this galaxy, the Aethery said, and its voice carried a sadness so old that it felt like gravity. And the pattern is always the same. They grow, they build, they discover the ability to destroy on a scale that terrifies their neighbors. And then they face the choice that defines everything that follows. What choice? Vasquez asked. The choice between dominion and guardianship, the Aethery replied, between using their strength to rule and using it to protect. And in our memory, which stretches back further than your species can easily imagine, almost every civilization that has gained the power you now hold has chosen dominion, because dominion is easier, feels natural, because the strong have always consumed the weak and called it the way of things. The Aethery paused, and in that pause, Vasquez felt the weight of millions of years of history pressing down on her shoulders. And those civilizations always destroy themselves in the end, the Aethery continued, because empires built on dominion carry the seeds of their own collapse, and the galaxy has seen 1,000 mighty species rise and burn, and leave nothing behind but ruins and cautionary tales. Morozov spoke for the first time, his voice rough with emotion he was not entirely able to control. "And what about us? You built weapons capable of ending worlds," the Etheri said. "You hid them for a century and a half, and when you finally revealed them, you used them to protect a species that could never repay you. And when you won the war that followed, you rescued your enemies from the wreckage of their own ships. This is not the pattern we are accustomed to seeing." The Etheri offered humanity a gift that no species had ever received: access to the Etheri Knowledge Archives, a repository of technologies and sciences and histories spanning millions of years, containing answers to questions that humanity had not yet learned to ask. But the gift came with a condition, spoken with a gravity that made both Vasquez and Morozov understand that it was not a suggestion, but a covenant. "Power must remain married to mercy," the Etheri said. "If you sever the two, if you allow your strength to exist without compassion, then we will remember that as well. And the consequences will be older and deeper than anything your weapons could withstand." Vasquez accepted, and she did so with the understanding that she was making a promise not just for herself, but for every human who would ever live. Back on Earth, the secret of Project Leviathan was finally revealed to the public, and the reaction was everything that Morozov had expected: pride and awe mixed with unease and anger, because the scale of the deception was staggering, and the realization that their own government had kept the greatest secret in history from them for 140 years was not easy to accept. Morozov faced a governmental inquiry that lasted 3 weeks, and he answered every question with the blunt honesty of a soldier who had made his peace with judgment long ago. "We lied to the galaxy and to our own people," he told the inquiry panel, and he did not flinch from the weight of those words. "I will not pretend that was without cost. Families were separated. Resources were diverted from civilian needs. Entire generations lived under a deception they did not choose and could not have consented to. And I carry that burden, and I will carry it for the rest of my life." He paused, and when he spoke again his voice was quieter, but no less steady. "But I would rather be judged for building a shield in secret than be mourned for having none at all." In the months that followed, the 7 Leviathans were repositioned across the galaxy, not as instruments of conquest, but as guardians, each one taking station near regions where vulnerable species had spent centuries living in fear of their more powerful neighbors. Prometheus orbited near the Rathani homeworld, its vast presence in the sky a constant reminder that the days of unanswered aggression were over, and species that had once feared humanity now sent delegations requesting Leviathan presence near their own borders. And the world ships that had been built as weapons of war became something no one had expected: symbols of hope. Sekval, the Krython analyst who had first noticed the anomalies and been imprisoned for trying to sound the alarm, was offered asylum by humanity, and he accepted with a mixture of gratitude and the peculiar grief of someone who had been proven right about everything and wished he had been wrong. He became the first non-human liaison officer aboard a Leviathan, assigned to Prometheus at Morozov's personal request, and he spent his days helping to build the new diplomatic frameworks that would define the galaxy's future, and his evenings standing on the observation deck, watching stars that looked different from this side of history. One evening Morozov joined him there, and they stood in silence for a long time before Sekval spoke. "I spent my career trying to warn my people about you," he said, and there was something almost like laughter in his voice. "And in the end, your hidden strength saved my people from themselves. I am still not sure whether that is ironic or simply the way the universe works." Morozov smiled, a rare expression for a man who carried the weight he carried, and replied, "Maybe it is both." The story closed in the Grand Concord Assembly, now restructured with genuine checks on military power, real accountability, mechanisms, and seats reserved for species that had previously been too small or too frightened to speak. A young delegate from a newly spacefaring species, just admitted to the Concorde, still wide-eyed with the wonder of a civilization taking its first steps into the larger universe, turned to a veteran ambassador seated beside her and asked a simple question. "What are the humans like?" The veteran paused, and a complicated expression crossed his face, something between respect and awe and a healthy amount of caution. And when he spoke, his words carried the weight of someone who had watched the galaxy transform. "They are small," he said. "They are fragile. They live on a single pale world, orbiting an unremarkable star, in an unremarkable corner of the galaxy. And if you passed their system without stopping, you would never think twice about it." He looked at the human delegation across the chamber. Vasquez in her usual seat, calm and composed, surrounded by allies who had once not known her name. "And they are, without question, the most terrifying and most compassionate species this galaxy has ever produced," he continued. "Do not make the mistake of underestimating them, and do not make the greater mistake of becoming their enemy, because they would much rather be your friend." The young delegate looked across the chamber at the humans, and she saw nothing extraordinary, just a handful of small, soft beings sitting quietly among thousands of species. And she thought about world-sized ships, and shattered gas giants, and rescued enemies, and ancient covenants. And she realized that the most dangerous thing in the universe was not strength, or weapons, or size. It was being the kind of species that the galaxy forgot to watch. And humanity, she understood, had been exactly that kind of species, until they decided it was time to be remembered.